The sun had barely risen over the sleepy town of Riversedge when the incident that would shock the community, and later the world, unfolded. A quiet morning near the riverbank quickly turned into chaos, leaving everyone who witnessed it questioning everything they thought they knew. It started like any other day, but fate had a way of twisting the ordinary into the extraordinary. Officer Carter, a veteran cop with over 2 decades on the force, was known for his no-nonsense attitude and stern demeanor. He was the kind of officer people either respected or avoided, and he didn't much care which one it was. This morning, though, his usual calm was interrupted when a call came through about a suspicious individual by the river. The dispatcher's voice was vague, but Carter, being Carter, didn't ask questions. He simply got in his cruiser and headed to the scene. At the river, a young woman stood by the water's edge, a silhouette framed by the gentle ripples and the first golden light of day. Her name was Maya, and she was an artist, often finding peace in sketching nature during the early hours. She was there with her sketch pad, completely unaware that her morning ritual would soon be interrupted in the most unexpected and dangerous way. When Carter arrived, he saw Maya and immediately made assumptions. She wasn't dressed in a way that suggested trouble, but for reasons he couldn't fully explain, or perhaps didn't want to admit, he felt uneasy. He approached her briskly, his authoritative tone cutting through the morning stillness. "What are you doing here?" he demanded. Maya, startled but composed, turned to face him. "I'm just sketching," she replied, holding up her pad to show her harmless intent. But Carter wasn't satisfied. Something about her confidence seemed to agitate him. "You're trespassing," he stated, though it wasn't true. The riverbank was public property, a place Maya had visited countless times before without issue. "I'm not trespassing," Maya said firmly, though she could feel her heart start to race. "I come here all the time." Her calm defiance seemed to irritate Carter further. He stepped closer, his imposing figure now looming over her. "I said you're trespassing," he repeated, his voice colder this time. Maya knew better than to argue, but something in her wouldn't let her back down completely. "Officer," she said carefully, "I don't think there's any law against being here. Maybe we cooled." Before she could finish, Carter's frustration boiled over. In a moment that would haunt him forever, he acted impulsively, shoving Maya with enough force to send her stumbling backward into the river. The cold water enveloped her with a splash, and for a few seconds there was only silence, save for the sound of the current. Carter stood frozen, his breath caught in his chest. He hadn't meant to push her that hard. He didn't even understand why he had pushed her at all. Panic gripped him as he watched the spot where she had fallen, the ripples expanding outward. Seconds felt like hours, and for a terrifying moment, he thought she wasn't going to resurface. But then, to his astonishment, Maya broke through the surface, her expression fierce and determined. Her eyes locked on his, filled not with fear, but with an intensity that made him take an instinctive step back. Water streamed from her hair and clothes as she waded toward the bank, each step deliberate and unyielding. "You shouldn't have done that," she said, her voice steady but charged with an energy that sent chills down Carter's spine. He didn't know what to say. For the first time in years, the seasoned cop found himself speechless. Something about her presence now felt different, almost powerful. Maya wasn't just a woman who had been wronged, she was a force to be reckoned with. And as she stood there, dripping wet and glaring up at him, Carter realized he might have made the biggest mistake of his life. What he didn't know was that this moment was just the beginning. What would follow would unravel secrets, challenge perceptions, and force everyone involved to confront truths they had long avoided. The quiet town of Riversedge was about to learn that sometimes the most unassuming people are the ones who leave the greatest impact. Maya stood there, the chill of the river water clinging to her, her breath steady, but her heart racing. Every fiber of her being told her to stay calm, to not let her anger or fear take control. She wasn't the kind of person to lose her composure easily, but this was different. She wasn't just standing up for herself anymore. It felt bigger than that, like this moment wasn't just about her, but about something much deeper, something she couldn't yet name. Carter still hadn't moved. He was rooted to the spot, unsure of what to do next. His training told him to take control of the situation, but how could he? Maya wasn't a criminal. She wasn't dangerous. And yet, something about the way she was looking at him now made him feel small, I suppose even. "You don't get to do this," Maya said finally, her voice low but steady. There was no yelling, no hysteria, just a calm strength that cut deeper than any scream could have. Carter opened his mouth to respond, but no words came out. He couldn't explain why he had reacted the way he did, and the weight of his actions was starting to sink in. Around them, the world felt unnaturally quiet, as if even the river itself was holding its breath. Maya climbed the bank, water dripping off her clothes and pooling at her feet. She held her sketchpad tightly against her chest, though it was now thoroughly soaked. It didn't matter. The sketches inside were replaceable. What wasn't replaceable was the dignity she was determined to hold on to, no matter what. "What's your name?" Carter finally asked, his voice uneven. It was a weak attempt to reassert control, to make this feel like any other interaction he'd had in his years on the force. But it wasn't. Maya raised an eyebrow. "Why?" "So you can write it down in some report that makes me look like the problem." Her words hit harder than she expected. Carter's jaw tightened, but he didn't respond. "I'm not giving you my name," Maya continued. "Not until you tell me yours, because I think we both know this isn't about me sketching by the river." The accusation hung in the air between them, sharp and undeniable. Carter's mind raced, searching for something to say, something to justify his actions, but there was nothing. He knew she was right. He had acted out of frustration, maybe even prejudice, and now he was faced with the consequences. "I'm Officer Carter," he said finally, though the words felt hollow. "Officer Carter," Maya repeated, as if testing the weight of his name. "Do you treat everyone like this, or am I special?" Her question wasn't sarcastic, it was genuine, and that made it even harder for Carter to face. Before he could respond, the sound of an approaching vehicle broke the tension. Both of them turned to see another police cruiser pulling up to the scene. Out stepped Officer Ramirez, a younger cop with a reputation for being fair and level-headed. "Carter," Ramirez called out as he approached, his gaze shifting between the two. "What's going on here?" Carter hesitated. There was a misunderstanding, he said, his voice lacking its usual authority. Ramirez looked at Maya, his expression softening. "Ma'am, are you okay?" Maya nodded, though her eyes remained locked on Carter. "I'm fine, just wet." Ramirez frowned, taking the scene, the soaked woman, the tension in the air, the uneasy look on Carter's face. It didn't take much to piece together that something wasn't right. "Did he push you?" Ramirez asked, his tone careful but direct. Maya hesitated, weighing her options. She could tell the truth, but she knew how easily stories like hers could be twisted, how quickly the narrative could turn against her. "I slipped," she said finally, her voice even. Carter's eyes widened slightly, surprised by her response. He opened his mouth to speak, but thought better of it. Ramirez studied Maya for a moment, then nodded. "Okay, let's get you some help. Do you need a ride somewhere?" Maya shook her head. "I'll be fine. I live nearby." But as she started to walk away, something in her stopped her from leaving entirely. She turned back to Carter, her expression unreadable. "This isn't over," she said quietly. Her words lingered long after she disappeared down the path, leaving Carter and Ramirez standing in uncomfortable silence. "What happened here?" Ramirez asked again, this time more firmly. Carter sighed, running a hand through his hair. "I don't know," he admitted. "I think I screwed up." Ramirez didn't respond right away. Instead, he looked out at the river, his brow furrowed in thought. "You'd better hope she lets this go," he said finally, "because if she doesn't, this could get messy." Carter nodded, but he couldn't shake the feeling that things were already messy, far beyond what either of them could control. Meanwhile, Maya walked back to her small apartment, her mind racing. She wasn't sure why she hadn't told Ramirez the full truth. Maybe it was because she didn't trust the system to handle it fairly. Maybe it was because she wanted to handle it her own way. As she reached her building, she paused to look at her reflection in the glass door. Her hair was still damp, her clothes clinging to her. But what she saw in her eyes wasn't defeat. It was determination. Maya knew this wasn't just about her. It was about standing up to something bigger, something that had been allowed to fester for far too long. She wasn't sure what her next step would be, but one thing was certain. She wasn't going to let this slide. And neither, it seemed, was fate, because as she closed her door and sat down to dry off, she didn't notice the figure watching her from across the street, hidden in the shadows. The evening crept into Riversedge quietly, but for Maya, there was no calm. She sat in her dimly lit apartment, a towel draped over her shoulders as she sipped tea that had long gone cold. Her soaked clothes were piled in the corner, but the chill she felt wasn't from the water anymore. It came from the memory of Carter's face as he shoved her. His expression wasn't one of anger or purpose. It was something worse, carelessness. That kind of casual disregard wasn't new to Maya. She'd seen it before, in small ways and big, but today it had taken a physical form. She glanced at her phone sitting on the table. A part of her wanted to call someone, anyone, to vent, to seek advice. Her best friend, Layla, would be the first to tell her to fight back. Layla didn't believe in letting things slide, especially when it came to injustice. But Maya hesitated. Something about this situation felt different. It wasn't just about her own anger. It was about doing the right thing, for herself and for anyone else who might find themselves in her position. On the other side of town, Officer Carter was sitting in his kitchen, nursing a stiff drink he poured to steady his nerves. The day had gone so far off course, he could hardly process it. Pushing Maya wasn't just a mistake. It was a lapse in judgment that he couldn't take back. He thought about her words, the way she stared him down as if she could see straight through him. His wife, Clara, walked in, her face lined with concern. "You've been quiet since you got home," she said, leaning against the counter. Carter didn't look up. "It was a bad day," he muttered, swirling the amber liquid in his glass. "Want to talk about it?" she asked gently. He shook his head. "Not really." Clara hesitated, then sat down across from him. "Whatever it is, you know you can't just bury it. It'll eat at you." Carter knew she was right, but what could he say? That he'd let his temper get the best of him. That he might have jeopardized his career over a moment of weakness. Clara wouldn't understand. Or worse, she would, and she'd look at him differently from then on. "I'll handle it," he said finally, though he wasn't sure he believed it himself. Meanwhile, Officer Ramirez was back at the station, staring at his computer screen. Something about the situation at the river didn't sit right with him. Carter wasn't a saint. Everyone on the force knew he had his moments. But Ramirez had never seen him like that. His gut told him there was more to the story than either Carter or the young woman had let on. He pulled up the dashcam footage from Carter's cruiser, hoping it might shed some light. As he watched, a knot formed in his stomach. The video was grainy, but clear enough to show Carter shoving Maya into the river. Ramirez leaned back in his chair, exhaling sharply. This wasn't just a misunderstanding, it was a problem. A big one. Ramirez didn't know Maya, but he knew the kind of scrutiny she'd be under if this went public. People would question her story, pick apart her background, trying to find any excuse to shift the blame away from Carter. Ramirez had seen it before, and it always left a bitter taste in his mouth. But then there was Carter. Ramirez respected him, or at least he had until now. Was this a one-time mistake, or had Carter's actions today revealed something deeper, something Ramirez had been blind to? While Ramirez wrestled with his thoughts, Maya decided to take a walk. The air outside was cool and crisp, carrying the faint smell of wood smoke from someone's fireplace. She needed to clear her head to figure out what to do next. As she walked, she thought about all the stories she'd heard over the years, stories of people who had spoken up against injustice, only to find themselves punished for it. She paused at a small park bench near the river, the sound of the water rushing faintly in the background. Sitting down, she pulled out her phone and scrolled through her contacts until she found Layla's name. "Hey, Maya," said when Layla picked up, her voice soft but steady. "Maya, what's up?" Layla's voice was warm and lively, a stark contrast to Maya's mood. "I need to talk to you about something," Maya began. She hesitated, then launched into the story, recounting everything from her peaceful morning at the river to the moment she was shoved into the water. By the time she finished, Layla was silent, an unusual state for her. "Maya," she said finally, her tone serious, "you can't let this slide. This guy, he needs to be held accountable." "I know," Maya said quietly, "but it's not that simple." "What's not simple about it?" Layla shot back. "You were minding your own business, and he assaulted you. There's nothing complicated about that." Maya sighed. I didn't want to make things worse for myself. You know how these things go." Layla's voice softened. "I get it. I really do. But if you don't say something, he'll think he can get away with it. And what if he does it to someone else? Someone who might not be as strong as you?" Maya nodded, even though Layla couldn't see her. "You're right," she admitted. "I just need to figure out the best way to handle it." "You will," Layla said firmly. "And whatever you decide, I've got your back." After hanging up, Maya felt a little lighter, but the weight of her decision still loomed. She knew Layla was right. She couldn't let this go, but how she chose to move forward would matter. As she stood to leave the park, she caught a glimpse of movement out of the corner of her eye. A man in a dark hoodie was lingering near the edge of the park, his posture casual, but his presence unsettling. Maya's instincts kicked in, and she started walking briskly toward the main road. The man didn't follow, but Maya couldn't shake the feeling that she was being watched. Back at the station, Ramirez made a decision. He saved the dashcam footage to a secure drive and logged out of his computer. If Maya decided to come forward, she'd need evidence, and Ramirez wasn't about to let this get swept under the rug. For now, though, the tension in River Sedge hung heavy in the air. The paths of Maya, Carter, and Ramirez were tangled in ways none of them fully understood yet. And the story that had started by the river was far from over. Maya's footsteps quickened as she left the park, her eyes darting to every shadow and corner. She wasn't the kind of person who scared easily, but something about the man lingering in the hoodie put her on edge. She kept telling herself it was just her imagination, a product of the tense day she'd had. But every few steps she glanced over her shoulder, her instincts refusing to quiet. When she reached her apartment building, she fumbled with her keys, her hands shaking slightly. As she locked the door behind her, she leaned against it, exhaling a shaky breath. It was probably nothing, she told herself. Maybe just a guy out for a walk. But as she drew the curtains in her living room, her mind lingered on the moment, replaying it again and again. Her phone buzzed, pulling her from her thoughts. It was a text from Layla. Asterisk, call me if you need anything, okay? You're not alone in this. Asterisk. Maya stared at the message for a long moment before replying. Asterisk, thanks. I'll be okay. Just need to figure out our next move. Asterisk. Meanwhile, Carter sat alone in his car, parked on the edge of town near the same river that had become the center of his unraveling. The moonlight reflected off the rippling water, and the sound of the current felt deafening in the silence of the night. His thoughts were a chaotic mix of regret, fear, and anger. Regret for what he'd done, fear of what might come next, and anger at himself for losing control. He wasn't sure why he'd come back here. Maybe he thought the familiar setting would bring him some clarity or peace. Instead, it only reminded him of the moment he couldn't take back. His phone rang, startling him. It was Ramirez. Carter hesitated before answering. What is it? He asked, his voice heavy with exhaustion. You need to come to the station, Ramirez said, his tone unreadable. Why? Carter asked, though he had a sinking feeling he already knew. Just get here, Ramirez replied before hanging up. Carter sighed, gripping the steering wheel tightly before starting the engine. At the station, Ramirez was waiting, his face grim. He gestured for Carter to follow him to a private office. Once inside, Ramirez closed the door and pulled up the dashcam footage on the computer. He didn't say anything, letting the video play instead. Carter's stomach turned as he watched himself shove Maya into the river, the scene playing out like a bad dream. He had hoped the moment wasn't as bad as he remembered, but seeing it from the cold, objective lens of the camera only made it worse. "What do you want me to say?" Carter asked when the video ended, his voice low. "I want to know what you're going to do about this," Ramirez said, crossing his arms. Carter shook his head. "There's nothing to do. She didn't file a complaint. She even lied to cover for me. Maybe she's letting it go. Or maybe she's waiting for the right time," Ramirez countered. "You think this is just going to go away? You think she's going to forget what you did?" Carter didn't respond. He couldn't. Ramirez leaned forward, his voice firm but calm. "You messed up, Carter. Big time. But the way you handle this now will decide whether you make it worse or try to make it right." Carter didn't answer, but the weight of Ramirez's words settled over him like a lead blanket. Back at her apartment, Maya couldn't sleep. The day had drained her, but her mind wouldn't stop racing. She thought about Carter, about his face when she climbed out of the river. He hadn't looked angry. He'd looked scared, but scared of what? Of her, or of what he'd done? Her thoughts were interrupted by a knock at the door. She froze, her heart leaping into her throat. It was late, too late for visitors. Slowly, she approached the door, peering through the peephole. To her surprise, it was Ramirez. Maya hesitated before opening the door, leaving the chain on. "Officer Ramirez," she said cautiously. "What are you doing here?" "I'm sorry to bother you so late," he said, his voice calm and steady. "But I need to talk to you." Maya studied his face. It didn't look threatening, but after everything that had happened, she wasn't sure who to trust. "About what?" "About Carter," Ramirez said, "and about what happened today." Maya's grip on the door tightened. "I already told you. I slipped." Ramirez shook his head. "I know that's not true. I saw the footage." Maya's stomach flipped. You saw it." "Yes," Ramirez said, "and I saved it. If you decide to come forward, I want you to know that I'll back you up." Maya didn't know what to say. The offer was unexpected, and while it gave her a sense of validation, it also brought new fears. If she went public with this, she'd be thrust into a fight she wasn't sure she was ready for. "Why are you helping me?" she asked finally. "Because it's the right thing to do," Ramirez said simply. "And because people like Carter need to be held accountable, no matter how long they've worn a badge." Maya nodded slowly, her mind swirling with questions. "I'll think about it," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. Ramirez nodded in return. "Take your time, but know that you're not alone in this." After he left, Maya sat on the edge of her couch, staring at the floor. She had wanted justice, but now that it was within reach, it felt overwhelming. What would happen if she spoke out? Would people believe her? Would Carter retaliate? And then there was the man in the hoodie. The thought of him watching her sent a chill down her spine. She couldn't shake the feeling that he wasn't just a random passerby. But who was he? And what did he want? As the night wore on, Maya couldn't ignore the sense that everything was building towards something bigger, something she couldn't yet see. All she knew was that she was at the center of it, and there was no turning back. Maya barely slept that night, her mind refusing to settle. The weight of Ramirez's words clashed with the lingering unease from the man in the hoodie. Every creak of her apartment felt amplified, and even though her door was locked and bolted, she didn't feel safe. When the first light of dawn crept through her curtains, she finally gave up on the idea of sleep altogether and got up, her body heavy with exhaustion, but her mind sharper than ever. She spent the morning pacing her apartment, replaying the events of the day before and weighing her options. She could stay silent and hope the incident faded away, or she could speak up, risking everything but finally standing for what felt right. Layla's voice echoed in her mind, urging her to fight back. But the doubts kept creeping in. What if no one believed her? What if coming forward only made things worse? Her thoughts were interrupted by another knock at the door. Maya froze, her heart pounding as she crept toward the peephole. To her relief, it was Layla this time, holding 2 steaming coffee cups. "You look like you haven't slept," Layla said as Maya let her in, handing her one of the cups. "I haven't," Maya admitted, slumping onto the couch. Layla sat beside her, taking a sip of her coffee before speaking. "So, have you decided what you're going to do?" Maya shook her head. "I don't know. Ramirez said he'd back me up. But what if it's not enough? What if they find some way to twist this around?" "They might try," Layla said, her voice steady. "But you've got the truth on your side. And now you've got proof too. That's more than most people in your position ever get." Maya nodded slowly, her gaze drifting to the window. She knew Layla was right, but the fear lingered. Then, as if on cue, her phone buzzed. She picked it up, her stomach dropping when she saw the message. It was from an unknown number, and it read, "Asterisk. Be careful who you trust. Not everyone's on your side. Asterisk." Maya stared at the screen, her hands trembling. She showed it to Layla, who frowned deeply. "Who sent this?" Layla asked, her voice sharp. "I don't know," Maya said, her mind racing. Was it Carter, Ramirez, or someone else entirely? Layla stood up, pacing the room. "Okay, this just got serious. Whoever sent that doesn't want you to speak out. That means they're scared. And scared people make mistakes." Maya's stomach churned. What if they're not scared? What if they're just trying to intimidate me into staying quiet? Layla turned to her and her expression fierce. Then they picked the wrong person to mess with. Maya wanted to believe her friend's confidence, but the message had shaken her. Someone was watching her, and they didn't want her to know who they were. Across town, Carter sat in his squad car, staring at his phone. He had seen the same message Maya received, though he hadn't sent it. Whoever had, they were playing a dangerous game, and Carter didn't like being caught in the middle of it. His phone buzzed again, this time with a call from Ramirez. Carter hesitated before answering. "What is it?" he asked, his voice tense. "You're not going to believe this," Ramirez said, his tone serious. "I was just reviewing the footage again, and there's something else, something I missed before." "What are you talking about?" Carter asked, his pulse quickening. "There was someone else there that day," Ramirez said. "In the background of the dashcam footage, you can see a guy standing near the trees, watching the whole thing." Carter's grip on the phone tightened. "Are you sure?" "Positive," Ramirez said. "I don't know who he is, but he saw everything. And now I'm wondering if he's the one who sent that message." Carter's mind raced. If there was a witness, everything could change. This wasn't just about his word against Maya's anymore. Back at Maya's apartment, Layla was already brainstorming. "We need to figure out who sent that text," she said, pacing again. "How?" Maya asked, her voice shaky. "We could trace the number," Layla said. "Or maybe Ramirez can help. He seems like he's on your side." Maya hesitated. She wanted to trust Ramirez, but the message had made her wary. Could she really be sure he wasn't involved? Before she could respond, her phone buzzed again. Another message from the unknown number. Asterisk dumped, "Make this harder than it needs to be. Walk away." Asterisk. Layla grabbed the phone, reading the message aloud. "That's it," she said, her voice firm. "We're not letting them scare you. We're going to find out who's behind this, and we're going to make sure they don't get away with it." Maya nodded, her fear slowly giving way to determination. Whoever was trying to intimidate her clearly had something to hide, and if they thought she was going to back down, they didn't know her at all. As the day wore on, Maya and Layla began piecing together what little they could. But the more they uncovered, the more questions arose. Who was the man in the hoodie? Why had he been watching her? And what role did he play in all of this? The answers felt just out of reach, but one thing was clear. The truth was bigger than Maya had imagined, and she was about to find herself in the middle of a battle far more dangerous than she'd anticipated. The next day, Maya woke up feeling more resolved than she had in weeks. The fear that had gripped her was still there, but it no longer held her captive. She called Ramirez and agreed to meet him at the station. If this mysterious witness was real, she needed to know more. She told Layla to stay back this time. Her friend had already done so much, and Maya didn't want her to be in any potential danger. When Maya arrived at the station, Ramirez greeted her with a nod. He led her into a small, quiet office and closed the door behind them. On the desk was his laptop, paused at a frame of the dashcam footage. There, Ramirez said, pointing to the screen. "See him? Near the trees." Maya leaned in, squinting at the image. At first, she only saw shadows, but then her eyes caught it, a man, partially obscured but unmistakably present. He was wearing a hoodie, the same one she thought she had seen outside her apartment. "That's him," she said, her voice trembling. "He's been following me." Ramirez frowned. "If he's following you, that means he knows more than we thought. This could be our break, Maya. If we find him, he could testify." Maya nodded, but unease crept into her chest. "How do we find him?" "I've already started looking into it," Ramirez said. "The footage isn't clear enough for facial recognition, but I sent it to a friend who's an expert at enhancing images. If this guy has been hanging around, we'll track him down." The hours that followed were a blur of waiting and uncertainty. Maya stayed at the station, her nerves on edge as Ramirez worked. Finally, just as the sun dipped below the horizon, he got a call. "They found him," Ramirez said, his voice laced with urgency. "He's been spotted near the old warehouse by the docks." Maya's heart raced. "Are we going there?" "You're staying here," Ramirez said firmly. "It's too dangerous. I'll handle this." But Maya wasn't about to sit idly by. As soon as Ramirez left, she followed, keeping a safe distance. She wasn't sure what she expected to find, but she knew she couldn't just wait around. When she arrived at the docks, she saw Ramirez's car parked outside the warehouse. She crept closer, careful to stay out of sight. Through a broken window, she could see Ramirez talking to the man in the hoodie. Their voices were muffled, but she could make out bits and pieces of the conversation. "You've got to stop this," Ramirez was saying. "She's not backing down, and you're only making it worse." "She doesn't know what she's getting into," the man replied. "This isn't about her anymore. It's bigger than that." Maya's blood ran cold. Who was this man, and what did he mean? Before she could process, the man spotted her through the window. His eyes locked on hers, and for a split second she froze. Then he bolted, shoving past Ramirez and disappearing into the shadows. Ramirez turned, his expression a mix of shock and frustration. "Maya, what are you doing here?" "I couldn't stay back," she said, her voice shaking. "What did he mean? What's bigger than me?" Ramirez sighed, rubbing the back of his neck. "There's something you need to know, Maya. This whole thing, it wasn't random. That guy, he's not just some witness. He used to work with Carter." Maya stared at him, her mind reeling. "What? Why didn't you tell me?" "Because I wasn't sure until now," Ramirez said. "But it all makes sense. They were both involved in a case a few years back, something that got swept under the rug. I think this guy knows Carter's secret, and he's trying to protect it." Maya's head spun as the pieces fell into place. The shove into the river, the threats, the messages, it wasn't just about her. It was about covering up something much bigger. "Do you think Carter knows?" she asked. "I don't know," Ramirez admitted. "But if he does, he's been hiding it well." Before they could say more, Maya's phone buzzed. It was another message from the unknown number. Asterisk, "This ends tonight. Don't make me come find you." Asterisk. Maya showed the message to Ramirez, her hands shaking. "It's him. He knows I'm here." Ramirez nodded, his jaw tightening. "We need to leave. Now." As they made their way back to the car, the sound of footsteps echoed behind them. Maya turned just in time to see the man in the hoodie emerge from the shadows, his face now fully visible. "You should have stayed out of this," he said, his voice cold. Ramirez stepped in front of Maya, his hand on his holstered weapon. "It's over. You don't want to make this worse." The man smirked, pulling something from his pocket. For a moment, Maya thought it was a weapon, but it was a small flash drive. "This," he said, holding it up, "is what you're really after." "What's on it?" Maya asked, her voice steady despite her fear. "The truth," the man said. "But the truth comes with a price." Before they could react, he tossed the drive toward them and disappeared into the night. Ramirez caught it, his expression unreadable as he stared at the tiny device. Back at the station, Ramirez plugged the drive into his computer. Maya watched as files and videos loaded, revealing evidence of corruption, cover-ups, and crimes that stretched far beyond Carter's actions. "This is it," Ramirez said, his voice filled with both awe and dread. This is what they were trying to hide. Maya felt a mix of vindication and fear. The truth was out, but exposing it would change everything. For her, for Carter, and for everyone involved. And as she stared at the screen, she couldn't shake the feeling that this was just the beginning. Maya sat in silence as the weight of everything they had uncovered settled over her. The files on the flash drive were damning: years of corruption, buried cases, and a web of deceit that went far beyond Officer Carter. It was clear now that his actions were just one thread in a much larger fabric of wrongdoing. Ramirez leaned back in his chair, running a hand through his hair. "This is bigger than I thought," he said, his voice heavy. "If we take this to the authorities, it could blow the whole department wide open." Maya's hands trembled as she stared at the screen. The images and documents laid bare the lengths people would go to for power, money, and protection. It was horrifying, but it also confirmed what she'd known deep down. What had happened to her wasn't just an isolated incident. "What happens if we report this?" she asked. Ramirez sighed. "Best case, the good cops step up and do the right thing. Worst case, the people involved in this find a way to silence us before it sees the light of day." Maya swallowed hard. The thought of retaliation made her stomach churn. But she also knew she couldn't walk away now. Too much had been revealed, and staying silent would make her complicit in the very system that had tried to break her. "We have to do it," she said firmly. "If we don't, they win." Ramirez nodded, his expression resolute. "I'll back you up. But we need to be smart about this. We'll take the files to someone we can trust, someone outside the department." The next few days were a whirlwind of careful planning. Ramirez reached out to a federal investigator he trusted, someone with no ties to the local police. Maya, meanwhile, worked with Layla to prepare her statement, recounting everything she had experienced. The process was grueling, reliving the trauma again and again, but Layla's steady presence kept her grounded. When the day came to hand over the evidence, Maya felt a mix of fear and relief. She and Ramirez met with the investigator in a neutral location, passing off the flash drive and detailing what they knew. The investigator assured them the case would be handled with the utmost discretion, but the fear of backlash lingered. Days turned into weeks as the investigation quietly unfolded. Maya stayed out of the public eye, keeping her routine as normal as possible. She still felt the weight of every step she took, the constant awareness that someone might be watching, but she also felt a growing sense of hope. Then one morning, her phone buzzed with an unexpected call. It was the investigator. "It's done," he said. "The files you provided were enough to launch a full-scale investigation. Several arrests have been made, including Officer Carter. The department is in chaos, but the truth is coming out." Maya's breath caught in her throat. It was over. The fear, the threats, the uncertainty, it had all led to this moment. "What happens now?" she asked. "But keep digging," the investigator said. "This is just the beginning. But thanks to you, we've got the leverage we need to bring the rest of them down." When the news broke, it was everywhere. Headlines screamed about the corruption scandal, naming Carter and several high-ranking officers as key players. The city was in uproar, and while Maya's name wasn't mentioned publicly, those close to her knew what she had done. Layla was the first to show up at her door, a wide smile on her face. "You did it," she said, pulling Maya into a tight hug. "We did it," Maya corrected, smiling for what felt like the first time in weeks. But the road ahead wasn't without challenges. Maya knew that exposing the truth was only the first step. There would be backlash, people who doubted her story, and others who tried to discredit her. But for the first time, she felt ready to face it. Months later, as the dust began to settle, Maya stood at the river bank where it had all started. The water was calm now, reflecting the soft light of the setting sun. She thought about how far she had come, how close she had been to giving up, and how much stronger she felt now. Layla joined her, carrying 2 cups of coffee. "Figured you could use this," she said, handing one to Maya. Maya took it with a grateful smile. "It feels different being here now," she said. "Like it's not just a place of pain anymore. It's where I decided to fight back." Layla nodded. "You turned it into something powerful. Not many people could do that." As they stood in silence, watching the water flow, Maya felt a sense of peace she hadn't known in a long time. The fight wasn't over, not for her, not for others who had been hurt by the same system. But she had taken the first step, and she knew she wouldn't be walking this path alone. When she returned home that evening, her inbox was flooded with messages from people who had seen the news, thanking her for her bravery and sharing their own stories. Maya read each one carefully, moved by the courage of strangers who had been inspired by her journey. She opened her laptop and began typing, her words flowing with purpose. She didn't know where this new chapter would lead, but she knew one thing for sure: her voice mattered, and she wasn't done using it. The river had tried to silence her, but she had risen stronger, her story rippling outward like waves, carrying hope to anyone who needed it.